Hello, everybody. Today's video covers a topic which I believe every gardener will probably have an opinion on, and that is the question of whether raised beds or in-ground beds are better for gardening. I'll cover the pros and cons of each, my personal preference, and a few raised bed mistakes that I've made to avoid. So let's jump right in with the pros of raised beds. And when I refer to raised beds, that's anything that has the planting medium framed in. Often you'll see raised beds made with wood, but they can be stone, brick, metal, any variety of materials as long as they are framed in. So the first big pro is that the planting medium in raised beds tends to dry out and warm up earlier than in-ground beds. This can be a game changer for folks with cold, wet springs and short seasons. Here in Ohio, planting in raised beds allows me to get some of my early cool season crops in several weeks up to a month earlier than my in-ground plantings. Raised beds can also improve accessibility to the garden. Depending on how tall you build your beds, they can make it much easier for folks with mobility issues to work in and pick from these beds versus having to kneel down and work in the actual soil at ground level. One benefit that I really like is that you can customize your soil makeup for specific crops that you're growing in raised beds. The best example I have of this here in my garden is this bed, which I created specifically with carrots in mind. Carrots do okay in my amended soil, but it's still a little heavier than what they would prefer. So for this bed specifically, we brought in a load of very sandy topsoil. I mixed it with compost, and every year I plant carrots here, and they do really, really well. And you could tweak your soil formulation for almost any crop. Nutrient-rich and high in organic matter for heavy feeders, less rich and quicker to drain for many types of herbs, higher or lower in pH, the possibilities are almost endless. The only thing, which I will talk about in the cons section, is that this can get to be expensive. Raised beds can also be a great solution for poor or contaminated soil. They can also help with critter control. The bottoms can be screened with something like hardware cloth to keep moles, gophers, and voles out. And if they're tall enough, they can deter rabbits. And of course, aesthetics can go into the choice of whether to use raised beds in the garden or not. Some folks prefer the very neat and tidy look of framed-in beds, and there are raised bed gardens that look absolutely beautiful. But don't think for a second that in-ground beds can't be lovely too. Now, raised beds aren't without their downfalls, and there are a few cons I want to mention to raised bed gardening. Now, I know I mentioned that it is a benefit that the soil dries out faster in the spring, but this can actually be a con to raised bed gardening as well. This is especially true as we move into the hotter, drier months of the summer. So in July and August, my raised beds require much, much more water than my in-ground beds do. Raised beds can also be expensive to build, and they typically require repairs or maintenance. Now, if you are the crafty and resourceful type, there are definitely a lot of ways to build raised beds for cheap or even free. In fact, the only reason that I have so many beds over here on the east side of my garden is because I was able to get these secondhand for free. But if you're looking at building raised beds from all new materials and you have quite a few to build, those costs can add up pretty quick. Cedar is frequently recommended for raised beds if you're going the wood route because it is naturally rot resistant. I don't know if you've taken a look at the price of cedar lately, but it is way out of the budget that I am willing to spend. I've also heard from a few folks that their cedar beds haven't lasted as long as they were hoping either. Opting for metal or stone is another non-rot option. However, if you go the cheapy route, as I did with these beds, which I believe are untreated pine, you're going to be repairing or replacing in a relatively short time. These are only 5 to 6 years old, and you can see that I've got some major repair work to do here. Some of these I've already completely scrapped and gotten rid of because they've been so rotten and broken down. Now, in addition to the cost of building the actual beds, there's also the cost of filling them. Again, the expense you rack up is dependent on the route you go to fill. There's certainly many ways that you can source fill material for free. You may be able to find local soil or compost for free or cheap, but if you have a lot of raised beds to fill, again, this can all add up over time. Now, what's worrisome to me is depending on where you source your fill material, the quality and the source of origin can sometimes be questionable. We have landscape companies around here that are selling topsoil that I know for a fact are coming from construction sites where there is no actual topsoil to be had. This stuff would be more accurately labeled as fill dirt. And don't get me started on the bagged crud that they sell at many of the nurseries and garden centers labeled as topsoil or for container gardening. I'm sure there's good stuff out there, but I've tried a few of the really widely available brands, and that stuff is not good. Now, another con to raised bed gardening is that depending on the size and setup of your beds, they can actually restrict root development. Now, with a big double layer bed like this that's built directly on top of native soil, really not much of an issue. But when you get into the shorter, say like an 8-inch tall raised bed, if that's put directly on top of something like pea gravel or landscape fabric and then filled with, say, 6 inches of soil, if you're trying to grow big, vigorous plants like some of the tomatoes, some of the cucurbits, worse yet, some perennial shrubs or even trees in a bed like that, you're going to severely restrict the ability of those roots to spread and grow deep like they want to. And what often happens with restricted root growth is that the plants don't develop properly and yield decreases. Now, one of the big concerns that I often hear from folks about raised bed gardening is the concern over the potential of chemicals or heavy metals, other detrimental materials leaching from this framing material into the soil and eventually making its way into the food that we're growing. That discussion often centers around the use of treated wood in the garden. Now, I know this is a big polarizing subject, so I'm just going to touch on a few bits of information that I found out there about treated wood. But the big concern historically has been with the arsenic content in CCA, that is chromated copper arsenate, that used to be used to treat wood. However, the use of arsenic in any wood product that is destined to be used by a homeowner, so whether that's landscaping, gardening, home projects, was phased out as of the end of 2003 per the EPA. Currently, any wood purchased at lumber outlets for residential use is treated with CA or ACQ. ACQ or AC treated lumber is not expected to have adverse health effects on adults or children, according to the publicized Human and Ecological Risk Assessment in 2007. So take that for what you will. And I absolutely understand the choice to use no treated wood whatsoever in the garden, but that is a personal choice. Now, keep in mind too that the risk of and the amount of any contaminants leaching into the soil and getting into your homegrown produce is going to depend a lot on the type of soil you have as well. In general, more acidic soil, so lower pH soil, is going to be quicker to leach chemicals than a more basic or alkaline soil. Clay tends to bind up contaminants and not release them. So more clay-rich soil is going to hold contaminants and not allow them to move into the plants as much as something like a sandy soil will. Now, for more information on this topic, because it is very complex and could be a video in itself, I have linked an article from the Penn State Extension in the video description below with a little bit more information about using treated lumber in the garden. But if you want to opt for the non-treated route, there are a lot of options without going the cheapy rotten pine route like I did. The first, as I mentioned earlier, is simply to opt for a more naturally rot-resistant wood. Varieties like oak, cedar, redwood, and cypress tend to work well. Stone can make a great option, and there are some newer non-toxic wood waterproofing products coming out to the market now. This includes products like Garden Seal, and I've been hearing good things about Timber Pro's internal wood stabilizer. So what about in-ground beds? I feel like they're kind of losing the popularity contest amongst gardeners, especially newer gardeners, but there are a lot of pros to in-ground beds as well. Now, some of the positives are going to vary depending on what type of native soil you are starting with. Here in my Ohio garden, my soil tends to be very clay-rich, which comes with its own set of problems, but has a lot of unique benefits. Now, one of the biggest pros for me is that my clay-rich soil tends to hold water. And while this is aggravating in the early spring when I want to get planting, for the majority of the season, this is actually a really big benefit. Because the soil holds water well, I have to water very, very little. I've mentioned in some of my other videos that I can often get away with only watering a couple of times through the active growing season. Some folks have commented on my videos that they think that this is BS and I'm lying. I am not. I have no reason to lie about this. The fact is that between my soil type, my extensive use of natural mulches, and a few summertime storms, I really have to water my in-ground beds very little. The same cannot be said for my raised beds, where if it's hot and dry through July and August, I'm watering them at least once a week. More often than that if I'm trying to get new plants or seeds established. Now, the obvious solution to that problem would be to rely on some type of a drip irrigation system. The trouble is that our water here is very, very hard. It's got a lot of iron in it. So often my irrigation lines get gunked up so quickly that it's not even really worth the trouble or expense of trying to set up a system. I'm still toying with these ideas, but for the meantime, I just really prefer my in-ground beds for that reason. Now, the big pro to in-ground gardening for everyone is that it's free. There's no need to buy anything. No framing material, no fill dirt, no nothing. Now, depending on your preferences and your budget, you could, of course, spend money bringing in amendments, buying compost, buying cover crop seed, those types of things, which are still relatively inexpensive as compared to some of the expenses associated with raised beds. But again, if you're resourceful, a lot of this stuff can be had for free. I know that many folks have mentioned that their township will do free compost. They'll give away leaf mulch, which can be turned into beautiful leaf mold. You can make your own compost. We have a lot of farmers around our area that are willing to give you their old animal manure if you just come and scoop it out of their barns for them. There are a lot of options out there. I feel like a lot of gardeners, especially new gardeners, get a little overwhelmed with the prospect of having to sink a lot of money into something that they're not even sure is going to stick. So if you want to just try out gardening and see how you like it, but don't want to spend a ton of money on raised beds, it can be a little off-putting. But honestly, sometimes I feel like we've made it too complicated. It can be as simple as going out in the backyard, killing off a spot of grass, working up that soil and planting. Now, in most soil types, you're going to have better results as you improve that soil, and that may take a couple of years. In my case, at about year 3, my soil was getting notably better than it was when I started. But even then, I think putting that time and effort into improving the native soil is well worth it. You may not have the most amazing garden the first year out, but that can build and get better over time. Now, one final pro to raised beds is that it's relatively easy to change your garden layout and design. That's not necessarily the case with raised beds, where the layout often feels more permanent. You're also typically more restricted in terms of the size and shape of the beds you can do, whereas with in-ground beds, the sky's kind of the limit. Now, of course, we've got our cons with raised bed gardening as well. And that water holding ability that I mentioned earlier, that is a downfall in the early spring. So in-ground beds in general tend to stay colder and wetter longer in the spring than a raised bed would. You can see here in my garden with all the recent rain we've had, there is still standing water in these aisleways, and this soil is very, very wet. We've had years where the soil does not dry out till almost the end of May. Now, in a no-till system, this can be less problematic, but if your gardening style is to wait until that soil dries out enough to till everything up and then plant, and you're having to wait till the middle or the end of May to do that, here in Ohio anyway, and similar growing areas, you've lost your window of opportunity for growing most of those cool season plants in the spring. So things like cauliflower, peas, lettuce, spinach, anything that's not going to tolerate heat, most of that stuff needs to go into the ground anywhere from mid-March to mid-April here. Another big deterrent for in-ground gardening is soil quality. If your soil is very rocky, has major drainage issues, or worse, has contaminants in it, it is going to be quicker and easier to build raised beds and plant in those than it is going to be to improve the soil. However, if you're just dealing with poor drainage or rocky soils and not with contaminants, I highly recommend looking into hugelkultur as an alternative to raised beds. It has many of the same benefits, but can be cheaper to build and can improve soil quality over time. Now, depending on your gardening style, as well as where you are gardening, in-ground beds can also have the detriment of coming with more weeds. Typically, raised beds do tend to stave off weeds longer than an in-ground bed will. Now, eventually you'll get some, but I do find that even over time, I have less weed growth in my raised beds than in my in-ground beds. Now, if you followed along with my channel for any amount of time, I'm sure that you've noticed I have both raised framed-in beds and in-ground beds in my garden. If I was hard-pressed to only pick one style for the rest of my gardening days, it would hands down be in-ground beds. The vast majority of crops that I'm growing perform better in the in-ground beds, and I suspect this has a lot to do with the nutrient profile as well as a richer microbial diversity in the soil. The other big reason for me is the watering. I hate watering, probably more than any other gardening task. So the fact that I can get away with so much less watering in the in-ground beds just makes it the clear winner for me. This does come with one caveat though. All of my in-ground beds are raised slightly. So I get some of the benefits of raised beds without the work and expense of framing those beds in. It does require some maintenance on my part to shore those beds back up as they start to sink over the seasons, but it's time well spent. I get the benefit of beds that dry out more quickly, have better drainage than the surrounding areas, and don't suffer from compaction because I'm never walking on them. Fortunately for me, in my gardening world, I don't have to choose one method. I found that a mixed hybrid approach of using in-ground, framed raised beds, hugelkultur, even large containers works really well for the different goals that I'm trying to achieve in my garden. As I mentioned earlier, the reason I have as many raised beds as I do is because I was able to pick up some for free. But when it comes right down to it, I could probably get away with just the 3 double height beds that I have. That would be plenty for my purposes. I utilize these beds the most for my early season plantings, so I will always do carrots in some of these. I also plant these out with early season greens like lettuce and spinach, salad turnips, peas, more of my moderate to late feeders. I typically plant large heading brassicas like cabbage, broccoli, and cauliflower in ground, as well as kohlrabi and kale. As the cool season plants are finishing up in the raised beds, I typically replace them with flowers and sometimes cover crop. I also like to grow rhubarb in my raised beds, as this helps to avoid the rot that can sometimes occur when I'm not careful enough about planting in a well-draining spot in ground. Sometimes I will also use my raised bed for crops which I'm planning on growing well into the winter, for example, carrots and beets for a December harvest, or overwintering, as I know they won't be sitting in wet, cold soil for extended periods of time, which can be a killer. Now, I did want to share my personal raised gardening mistake with you all so that anyone contemplating adding them to the garden doesn't have to go through the same waste of time and money that I did. Early on, when I was setting this garden up, I was in a big rush to get a couple of beds in and get planting. I had a lot of the fabric weed barrier on hand and got the bright idea that I could just lay it all down in this weedy corner of the garden and put my raised beds directly on top of it, thereby keeping the weeds at bay. I then went to my local garden center and bought several large bags of some kind of soil mix for containers and filled up those beds. The first couple of seasons were fine. Lots of beautiful lettuce and herbs were grown in those beds, but not much else. I could tell the soil quality wasn't that great and tried my usual techniques of adding organic matter, cover cropping, etc. to no avail. After a couple of seasons, weeds were also working their way up through the fabric and were 20 times harder to pull out than those that were just growing in the bare dirt. I decided I'd had enough and just ripped the whole thing out. The fabric was the first mistake. It limited the depth to which plant roots could penetrate and kept any beneficial critters like earthworms from working their way up into the beds from the soil below. In fact, when I removed the dirt from the first bed, the only critters that were present in any significant amount were pillbugs and wireworms. I'm willing to bet the microbial life in this bed was next to zilch as well. Essentially, this was dead dirt, which was my second big mistake. The stuff I purchased was not great quality to begin with, but then by preventing the fill dirt from mixing in with my native soil, I was just kind of left with a sterile planting medium. If I had pumped it full of fertilizer, things might have grown, but I never would have really been able to regenerate the soil. So when I added a few more beds, I put them straight on top of the native soil, skipped the fabric, though I do wish I would have put hardware cloth on the bottoms to help deter moles, and focused on a better soil mix. For most of these, with the exception of the carrot bed, I ended up using a mix of regular topsoil, compost, some soil that I actually brought up from our woods, and over the years I've added leaf mold, chicken litter and manure, more compost, and whatever other organic matter goodness I can get a hold of. Now, a one-size-fits-all approach rarely ever works in gardening, so you'll have to decide for yourself which method of beds works the best for you. But I do highly recommend giving some thought into how you can regenerate your native soil if that's a possibility. That may look like using raised beds for 2 or 3 years until that soil is healthy and healed, but I think that you'll be happy with the results in the long run. Now, for more on how I have worked on improving my native soil here in my Ohio garden, check out my It Starts With Soil playlist. And I'd love to hear from you. What type of gardening beds do you prefer and why? Drop a line in the comments below and let me know. And if you enjoyed today's video, please consider subscribing to my channel, Growfully with Jenna. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.